Welcome to another episode of MrLopezClasses.com. This is the second chapter of the diesel engines book. This is the first episode of the second chapter. In this episode, we are going to talk about bearings and gaskets. What type of bearings we are going to use in a typical diesel engine, and how is the procedure to select the bearings. What is the procedure to replace the bearings, and some recommendations, some tips in order to replace, in order to service the bearings properly. Okay, we are going to start with the theory related with bearings. The bearings are basically elements used to avoid friction in between two rotating parts. There are elements used to avoid friction in between two parts. And there are different type of bearings. There are bearings, ball bearings. The most common bearing is the ball bearing. This one, and those type of bearings are excellent for radial loads. The ball bearings are excellent for radial loads. There are different types of bearings. This is the most common, the ball bearings. And there are other bearings like this one, roller bearings. And there are other ones like these ones. Those are plain bearings. What is the material used on plain bearings? There are two types of plain bearings used in diesel engines, diesel and gas. Plain bearings for the crankshaft, plain bearings for the camshaft, and the material is babbitt. It's an alloy of bronze, antimony, and aluminum, and zinc. The other name for the babbitt is soft alloy. I'm going to explain what is the meaning of that. Or soft metal. Those are plain bearings. Those are roller bearings. Okay, two main types of bearings: plain bearings and anti-friction bearings. The plain bearings are sliding bearings. Typically, the journal bearings on the crankshaft are sliding bearings. Or other ones, the shafts run directly on the bearing surface. For example, on the camshaft. The other type of bearings are anti-friction bearings. There are basically ball bearings, roller bearings, and needle bearings. Right now we are going to talk about the other type of bearings. Plain bearings, the first group. Those are the plain bearings, and this is the babbitt. This is the metal, the soft metal located in this surface. It's an alloy of tin, antimony, copper, and lead. Alright, this is the soft bearing. There are other ones fabricated in bronze with sulfur and phosphorus. Bronze, phosphorus. Those are the typical bearings used on the star motor. The shaft of the star motor release in a couple of bearings, those bearings, bronze bearings. The bronze bearings like this, plain bronze bearings, are used in the shaft of the turbocharger. The turbocharger is spinning around 150,000 RPMs. It's a high speed. For that reason, those bearings are recommended for high speeds. Those bearings are used in turbochargers and are used in star motors. And those plain bearings are used in crankshaft, in crampings, in different type of engines, gas and diesel. Internally, the plain bearings The plain bearings is a shell of a steel covered with the soft metal. Those are the typical bearings used on the cramping of the engine or on the main journals. We are going to talk later about that nomenclature, the nomenclature of the crankshaft. Okay, the other type of bearings are ball bearings, and those are roller bearings, and those are tapered roller bearings. And right now I am going to explain the difference between this type of bearings and this type of bearings. Alright, the bearings are classified in three types according with the load. Radial load, if the load is in this direction. Axial load, if the load applied is in this direction. Or a compound load, if the load is a combination of this and this. If the load is in both directions. For example, in the previous example, in this example, this is a compound load, and this is radial. And let me show to you an example of axial. Yeah, this is radial. Okay, this is truss or axial, where the load applied is in the direction of the shaft, and this is a combination of load, is radial load with axial load. For that reason, the rollers are located with an inclination, with an angle. Those are combined truss or axial and radial. Those are the most common type of bearings. In a diesel engine we found all of them, and also in the transmissions. In the next class in transmissions I am going to explain how to replace those bearings. Probably if you visit the shop, we are going to do a project removing and replacing bearings. Alright, those are the ball bearings. The ball bearings are used for high precision applications in a variety of markets, including aeronautical, marine, agricultural, construction, health, machine tools. In general, in all type of industries you found ball bearings. Yeah, the radial bearings tolerate relative high speed operation under a range of load conditions. Those bearings are recommended for excessive radial loads, heavy loads, but the inconvenience of those bearings is that they produce too much noise. Yeah, that's the inconvenience of those bearings. The life of the bearings depends on the lubrication. Alright, this is the typical radial bearing. This is the installation of the radial bearing, and this is, for example, the radial bearing of this is the alternator. This is the crankshaft, and this is the hydraulic pump. There are three bearings connected by the belt. Typical radial bearings installation. Look at the axial bearings. Those are axial bearings, like the axial bearing that we have on the screen right now. Those are axial bearings support excessive axial loads. Yes, in your outboard, in the bottom of the gear, in the lower unit, you found an axial bearing. Or in the transmissions, like the transmission that you have on the screen right now, you have an axial bearing in each end of the main shaft. We are going to study later. There are three shafts in a typical transmission: input shaft, output shaft, and lathe shaft. Each of those shafts are supported for radial bearings and axial bearings. Alright, this is another example. Okay, the previous one is the typical axial bearings, And this one is a compound bearing because this one works in both directions. Look at this. This is a plain bearing compound. This plain bearing is used for both purposes, for radial loads and axial loads. Where is located those bearings? Yeah, in each end of the crankshaft. Normally in a gasoline engines, the Chevy 350, the Saint Mer Cruiser, use a couple of compound bearings, plain bearings, in each end of the crankshaft. There are small diesel engines with compound plain bearings. Yeah, those bearings they have in one surface like this, the babbitt, the material for the axial load, and in this area, the other Y material or babbitt in contact in between the crankshaft and the connecting rod. We are going to study later those bearings. There are angular bearings. You remember those bearings? Those bearings? Yes, the cables for throttle and gear. At the end, they have angular balls, angular connectors. Those connectors have 360 degrees of rotation, and they are excellent for rod ends, for throttle cables, for gear cables. Yeah, this is a very common, especially in controls, in control cables. Angular ball bearings. All right, and those are the typical roller bearings. The roller bearings are used for high speeds. The advantage of the roller bearing in comparison with the ball bearing is that the roller bearing produce less difference in between the shaft and the equipment, less distance. The ball bearings have more distance, more separation. There are three types of roller bearings: straight roller bearings, needle roller bearings, and taper roller bearings. Yeah, the needle roller bearings are the roller bearings used on the crankshaft of outboards, like the outboard that you have on the screen. We are going to study those engines in the class of gasoline, and the outboards, two strokes, they don't use plain bearings. They use needle bearings, roller bearings. Those bearings that you have on the screen right now are the bearings used in two-stroke outboard engines. In four-stroke engine, diesel and gasolines, those engines use plain bearings, like the bearings that you have on the screen right now. This is the typical picture about the roller bearings and needle bearings. This is for an axial bearing. This is for cage needle rollers, and this is for other cage needle rollers for different application, different millions of application. Normally for high speed, low noise, and low temperature, because depending on the lubrication, those bearings are for excellent lifelong. You don't need to replace those bearings frequently if the lubrication is good. Alright, there are different types of techniques to remove the bearings. There are different types of tools used to remove the bearings. In the majority of the cases, you need to use the hydraulic press, using the procedure that you have on the screen right now in order to remove the bearing. Or you can use extractors, extractor like the extractor that we have here on the screen, and you have on the main screen another example. Those are the typical extractors. The first one, these ones are used with the hydraulic press, and these ones are usually manually in order to remove bearings. You need to be careful when you remove the bearings. Never apply the force in the external ring, because you destroyed the bearing. You need to apply the force in the internal ring, because if you apply the force in the external ring, you destroyed the bearing. The secret to keep the bearings in properly conditions, operational conditions, is the lubrication. The lubrication is the secret to keep the bearings running for a long period of time.